Can I welcome you to the 11th meeting in 2013 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind members and everyone to switch off their mobile phones and other devices as they do affect the broadcasting system. We have apologies from Adam Ingram, and Gil Patterson is attending as substitute. Agenda item 1 is decision to take business in private. Can the committee agree to take agenda item 3 in private to allow the committee to consider an EU document which may raise issues of subsidiarity? And I also seek agreement to take any further consideration of community transport evidence and draft reports in private. Is that agreed? That is agreed, thank you. Agenda item 2 is community transport. We're going to hear evidence from regional transport organisations and local authorities as part of the committee's inquiry into community transport. This is the third oral evidence session on the inquiry, and the committee is keen to explore some of the emerging themes with those closely involved in local transport planning issues. So can I welcome the witnesses today, who are John Berry, Sustainable Transport Team Leader of the Association of Transport Coordinating Officers, Eric Stewart, Assistant Chief Executive, Operations Strathclyde Partnership for Transport, Rachel Mill, Chair of the Community Transport Association Scotland Committee, and Councillor Graham Phillips, Chair of Transport, Environment and Community Services, and David Summers, Transport Development Officer, both of Highland Council. Can I welcome you all to the meeting this morning, and can I invite all of you to give a brief introduction about yourselves and your organisations. So, Mr. Berry, would you like to start, and we'll go that direction?
Yes, good morning. Yes, my name is John Berry. I actually work at Dundee City Council. I've been working there for 3 years, and previous to that I worked at Perth and Kinross Council. So I've worked in both urban and rural local authority. You introduced me as being from the Association of Transport Coordinating Officers. That is like a professional organisation for local authority staff like myself who work in the field of transport, public transport, school transport, community transport.
Stewart.
Good morning. My name's Eric Stewart, the Assistant Chief Executive from SPT. SPT is both a regional transport partnership and a public transport authority. That for the 12 authorities on the West Coast, we retain the bus powers and provide subsidised bus services. We also operate the subway and ticketing schemes and various other things, but community transport is something that is becoming very prevalent to us, and something very keen to contribute to this debate. And my own background is, whilst I've been in the SPT 6 years, I was 20 years in the private sector bus industry prior to that, so a reasonable understanding of bus provision.
Rachel, we've met, but you haven't met the other members of the committee.
No, nice to see you again. My name's Rachel Milne, and I work in my day job for Dyla Community Bus in Buchan, Aberdeenshire. It's a community transport operation which I have been running for 13 years, has an associated social enterprise which creates an income for it. However, today I'm representing the Community Transport Association Scottish Committee, of which I'm chair. CTA, it's a national charity, an umbrella group for the members who run a variety of different types of community transport, from car schemes to small bus schemes to major bus schemes. My job here today is just to represent, hopefully, community transport across Scotland.
Okay, Mr. Summers.
Good morning. Councillor Phillips is going to do the introduction for Highland Council generally, so I'll just mention that I lead the passenger transport team within the council.
Thanks. Councillor
Good morning. I was elected to Highland Council 1 year ago, and the following day they asked me to chair the Tech Services Committee, which was an interesting introduction to council life. Highland Council, as I'm sure you all know, covers an area the size of Belgium, and after Eland Shire has the lowest population density of any local authority in Scotland. Compared to a Scottish average of 67 people per square kilometre, we have 9. In Sutherland, the figure is as low as 2.2 people per square kilometre. This means that we have isolated communities which are trying very hard not to die. Community transport is really the only transport there is. It's utterly strategic for us. So we support 100 public transport contracts in marginal areas and 23 community transport projects. These groups vary a great deal in size and nature, and as well as providing financial support, we provide operational advice and coordinate training activities. We've helped several groups develop Section 22 scheduled services. 2 groups hold school transport contracts, and I'm aware of another group that is about to bid for one now. So community transport for us is extremely varied in its nature. We are currently developing a pilot integrated transport hub in Lochaber with the NHS and the Scottish Ambulance Service, working with the school transport service. The community transport sector will be at the hub of this, organising it, booking it. That's absolutely key. We are at the point where we've got everybody to agree to take part. We're now trying to put the money together for a 12-month pilot with a 6-month extension as an option. And we're very interested to see where that will take us.
Okay, thank you very much. If I can start the questioning by asking you, all of your organisations think perhaps, with the exception of the CTA, are all involved in developing either regional transport strategies or local transport plans. So how do you involve community transport operators in the development and delivery of these plans? Perhaps you've answered it a bit, Councillor Phillips, but yes.
I think it's very important that we recognise that the community transport sector is bottom-up. And I, first of all, recognise the excellent work the CTA have done. They've been very active in the Highland Council area. There is a regular community transport forum which I try always to go to. They bring propositions to us, and we do our best to help them get going. I think that really is the best way to look at it. It's very important that we are able to help people through their development. So, for example, we need community transport organisations to be financing themselves as far as they can, and we've encouraged a number of them, we continue to do so, to go for Section 22. Your previous evidence sessions have talked about the difficulty of doing that, the cost of doing that. We will lease the ticketing equipment and the hardware to operating groups at a very low cost. We will provide the back office functions for them. We will help them with the submissions to the Traffic Commissioner. And so we do everything we can to smooth their path.
Anyone else? Mr. Stewart, here.
Chair, thank you. I think the legacy situation is there wasn't a great deal of engagement with community transport, but in recent years we've recognised that it is something that we are actively encouraging. We've most recently taken a framework and established a community transport network, so we have a proper vehicle now to actually engage with them. And over the last few years, SPT has invested nearly £3 million in stimulating community transport schemes and encouraging community transport groups to submit bids, which we try and give them assistance. And we don't put the challenge entirely on them. We do provide support, we do provide engineering guidance, we do provide assistance on how to structure a bid. We have assisted in most of the schemes that made Section 22 applications. We've done a lot of the work for them. So I think it's trying to take a pragmatic approach that historically community transport didn't feature significantly into public transport authorities' scope, and with the changing environment where mainstream bus mileage is reducing, communities are getting more and more isolated, it is a realistic and sensible opportunity for the benefits both communities, because we do equally provide a vehicle and ticket machines like my colleague, and we provide them on a full repair and lease basis and gift the bus essentially, and we will also pay for the service we operate. And the reality is that cost sometimes can be significantly more competitive than if you were employing the full cost of a mainstream PLC bus operator. So it is of necessity starting to plug gaps in the market, and we don't approach CT empty-handed. We try and provide the support, the bus, the finances and guidance and any expertise. We do send our engineers who are qualified on bus inspections, and they're under contract buses for schools and for our subsidised bus services. So they do go and provide training so that there is, pre-service checks. Very light touch, because you wouldn't want to stymie the sector by imposing bus regulations on it, you know, and this is not a one-fit-all solution. It's, you know, we actually have community transport services operating in the centre of Glasgow. We should not presume that isolation in a community sense is simply because it's in the Highlands. So CT does meet specific community needs, and if, you know, without being too direct about it, there is a cost opportunity for the public. You know, it's about the public purse in total, and there's a mutual benefit. So we do have established a network now. That's the specific name we've adopted, but it's not just you know, you come to us, we do provide that support, because I think there's a real recognition now that this is part of the future transport solution. But I think we also want to make sure that historically, when we have looked at it, there have been issues, and it's undeniable that I've had a letter saying I'm not a PLC operator, so I won't have all the wheel nuts in my bus. And we need to try and address these issues. This is about a reasonable quality expectation and safety, you know, principally about safety of the vehicle. But it's all right writing a letter. You need to go and give some support, because if they don't have that level of understanding, we should assist them, because there's a benefit to the public purse as well. Thank you.
And would you say that the community transport then is filling the gaps, or are they competing with private operators for routes, or in Strathclyde?
Thank you. I don't think they should be competing with private sector operators, because I think that's within the gift of politicians to review the regulatory environment we operate under. And at the moment, you know, competition for one route is really ridiculous. We have so many gaps in the market that before, and certainly wouldn't be of the view that we should be permitting CT to compete against private sector, because that should take a fundamental review of how you deliver bus services in Scotland. And whilst that would equally be welcome, this particular areas, there are so many gaps within community that CT has got a very useful and continuing opportunities, because if you do look at the mainstream bus mileages, they are going down. The need still is there. We just need to find more cost-effective solutions. And there's a whole package of measures that we submitted in our evidence that we believe would be helpful for people in our operating area, so that they get a level of you know, support, but experience and quality introduced. And that's no, I don't want that to be a caveat. All CT is poor. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. But it's about making sure there are reasonable standards maintained across the entire service.
Yeah, I must say we had very interesting evidence from Maggie Urey of South West Transport, who's obviously in your area, and that her evidence is very helpful. Mr. Berry.
Yes. My view would be that community transport isn't generally competing with the commercial public transport sector. It's not really designed to do that. Community transport is strongest and has established itself in communities and geographic localities where public transport services are poor or non-existent. And this is, I would say, community transport is predominantly and mostly at its strongest in rural communities. That's a bit of a generalisation, but I would say in the city where I work, Dundee, community transport is almost negligible, because there's excellent bus services, there are excellent taxi services. People don't really need to turn to the community transport sector for this level of service. If you go out to the Carse of Gowrie, which is the area between Perth and Dundee, you know, so just a few miles to the west of the city, you know, there's a real lack of transport, and people potentially there might be saying, you know, we would really like voluntary car schemes, we would like some kind of minibus service that's put on. So the issue here is that we've ended up with almost like a patchwork of services across Scotland. There's no, you know, regular level of service. In some communities, it's got established, it's got going, it's grown, it's become really impressive level of service. In other parts of Scotland, you'll find hardly any community transport provision at all. And it's just kind of by luck, because there was somebody in that community who had, you know, the gumption to get up and get going, you know, 10, 20, 30 years ago, and has established something. If you try to establish something now, certainly if it's like a local authority trying to impose it on a local community, it's very hard to make that grow, because it's been said it needs to kind of be bottom up, and unless you've got that bottom up demand, it doesn't really get going. And if there isn't a demand because there's already decent bus services or there's already decent taxi services, then it isn't there. You asked originally about the scale of you know, involvement of local authorities and partner agencies with the CT. I would say it definitely depends on the extent of CT in that area. So I would say in Dundee, where I work currently, engagement with the community transport sector is very limited because it doesn't really exist, whereas where I worked previously at Perth and Kinross, we had quite regular dialogue with the community transport providers, and there was lots of them. In all the little villages around Perthshire, Aberfeldy, Blairgowrie, Kinross, there were little groups all over that we had regular dialogue with.
So are you saying that elderly people can get to hospital appointments or doctor's appointments on regular buses, or they take taxis, to community groups that disabled people manage on regular transport? Are you saying that
Yes.
that's all covered by regular transport?
Right. Clearly, I would say the majority of elderly and disabled people can use good public transport in urban areas. There is going to be a sizable but small minority of people who find public transport is beyond them, and therefore they might be looking for some further assistance with other means of transport. That might be, for example, a taxi card scheme or a DRT service, but not necessarily a community transport service. A DRT service could be delivered by community transport.
What do you mean by DRT?
I beg your pardon. Demand responsive transport, which again is another bit of a vague, nebulous idea of a service that comes to you when you want it, as opposed to a scheduled bus service or a scheduled train service that runs at set times.
Defines that then, the DRT service?
Well, DRT services are provided by a number of different providers. Some parts of Scotland, they don't exist at all.
Talking about specifically?
In Dundee, I would say DRT is provided by the taxi trade.
Okay.
And what we have is a discounted taxi card service. So we, as a local authority, subsidise the cost of using taxis.
Can I ask, Eric, sorry,
Sorry,
you want to come back
if I
in?
could add a comment that a number of years ago, CTA, working with Max, identified there were 286 million annual unfulfilled trips for those who had the right to access the concession scheme but couldn't. So it's a big, big number. And in the Strathclyde area, we provide demand responsive transport. And like community transport, it is never the cheapest option. DRT, if we use the acronym, is, as community transport, is on a sort of pence per mile, an expensive solution, but sometimes it's the only practical solution because there's nothing cheaper than a double deck on the mainstream corridor full of people. But that isn't the need that CT nor demand responsive transport provides, and we provide it on a contracted basis, carrying over 500,000 passengers on our, it's now named My Bus service. I should say the award-winning My Bus service, but thank you.
Yes, Rachel, did you want to come in on this bit?
Could I just add some comments and maybe some challenges to some of the stuff that's been said? Section 22 has been mentioned by, I think, at least two people here. Section 22 is not the unique panacea to all of the problems. Section 19, car schemes, the whole gamut of community transport needs to be taken into to thought here. Section 22 works great between areas where you can have a regulated bus journey or you can have a certain direction of travel. DRT, demand responsive transport, is Section 19. We run several of them. And I think it all needs to be in the thought processes. As for comments on level of expertise, yes, there are community transport groups out there that don't quite have the level of expertise that none of us want, or all of us want. However, you tell me that the Traffic Commissioner isn't going to say that many PSV operators aren't of that level either. Myself, my own organisation, I'm a fully qualified transport manager. Several CT groups around Scotland are the same. Several of us run PSVs as well as Section 19s. We do run to quite high levels of quality, and we try, through the CTA and the CTA advice centres, we try and maintain that. We do hope that we do run to reasonable standards. Being a community transport operator does not mean to say you can twist the rules or you can ignore them. And I think that has to be put out quite clearly there. As for, sorry John, I'm going to argue with you as well, urban community transport is important, and I'm meeting with Aberdeen Council for Voluntary Organisations later this week to discuss community transport in Aberdeen, because it is a major issue in there. and we're hoping that through somebody like the Change Fund we can start to provide there, because many people can't access even a 1 mile trip to the hospital is just out with their abilities because they're housebound for one or another reasons.
Okay, Mr Summers and then Councillor Phillips, you both wanted to come in.
Right, thank you. In the Highland, we have demand responsive transport in the form of subsidised taxis or dial buses using minibuses in certain remote rural areas. We also have community transport, to some extent the availability of volunteers for the community transport versus the availability of an interested private sector contractor will determine which of these we adopt. On the strategy question where we started, Hightrans have hosted meetings of community transport operators from all across the Hightrans area, and that has fed into the production of the regional transport strategy. The initiative for these meetings comes from the community transport itself rather than from Hightrans, but that's something that has been done. As a council, in our own ongoing everyday dealings with community transport operators, we're aware of the people, we're aware of the organisations, we're aware of the issues, and that can feed into strategy development. But when we're producing or updating a local transport strategy, we'll have a specific consultation exercise as well. One of the key things that I think we need to develop, we've started to work on, but do a bit of a good deal of further development with, is the wider social benefit, which obviously is what this committee is interested in as well, but the wider social benefit of providing community transport, which I like to sum up with the phrase, the cost of not doing it.
Councillor Phillips.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up specifically on the question of Section 22, because I think Rachel's right in what she says. I have in mind a community bus in the village of Helmsdale in East Sutherland, where some of the time it's operating under Section 19, where some of the time community groups will hire it and they will travel 20 miles to go to a floral art group meeting in Golspie. Part of the day it's running a Section 22 service because that was a deal that was done with Stagecoach in order to connect with the first morning service to Inverness, so that for the first time ever young people in Helmsdale can go to college in Inverness without having to leave home. That's a terrific use, it's very flexible, and it's a very imaginative group of people that are doing that. While we're on Section 22, I think it's worth referring back to the evidence given to previous meetings where there was some lengthy discussion of the question of reimbursement for concessionary fares. The 60% threshold came up. Now,
onto that later.
Right, I have a point on that which I will come back to, right. But I did want to make the point that we do have a very flexible approach we can take if we are minded to.
Okay. Mr Summers, you kind of answered my next question, is which, and perhaps the others can now pick it up, that, you know, do any of your organisations, and I think you said this, Highland Council does, assist in the planning, coordination or scheduling of community transport services across the region or the authority? And if so, how does this work in practice?
We very much recognise that community transport has to start in the community and grow from within the community. So it's not so much assist with scheduling, but forming their ideas and their proposals, their initiatives. Now, we will review that when we're looking at funding. Is this meeting council objectives? Is this overlapping with some other provision that's there? Are we interested in funding it? And it may be that it'll be sort of 2/3 yes, 1/3 no, but we're very much looking to what the community's own solutions are, rather than imposing a top-down. Whereas with our contracts, we'll have community consultation, but when we award the contract, we are determining what the service is, and that's the major difference between our support for private sector operations and our support for voluntary sector.
Okay, anyone else want to pick up the question? Yes, Mr Berry.
I would agree. Community transport should be designed and developed by the community transport providers themselves. So this is the voluntary sector designing what they want to deliver. So it would be probably a bit improper almost for a local authority to come on and say, you must be doing this or you must be doing that. So in terms of planning and scheduling, it's down to the groups themselves and the communities themselves to design their service. And I suppose what a local authority might do is come and say, you know, we like what you're doing and we'll help with you with funding and support in that way. But in terms of sort of dictating and demanding and requesting certain things is probably, you know, it's not the approach that we're generally adopting.
Mr Stewart.
Thank you, Chair. I think generally, as John's saying, it's the bid and the stimulus is from the community transport groups, but there are certain areas where there is a smaller presence, and we have got some gaps in the market, if you can give that general reference, and we have stimulated. So I think this is a very early stage of the development of community transport, and I don't think there is a consistent, defined standard about how you consult in these issues. And the opportunities are being developed as we speak, with areas where there's no community transport that's seen. There is a need for some kind of bus provision. And not necessarily, I hear what was said, but we support many car schemes. This is not just about buses. We support car schemes and many other things. And I did qualify very strongly that I wasn't making a general reference about quality. There's good and bad. And what's not acceptable is bad at all. So, and it's a whole plethora of opportunities, and it's about collaborative working, and it is about people engaging with each other. And by and large, it's stimulated by the community transport or the community itself. But other times, we do stimulate that to encourage, and again, we will make sure that the funding is there to give them that kickstart that's necessary. So we're not expecting that there's some tooth fairy to fly in to fund it. It's very much that we will stimulate it properly. Thank you.
Rachel, did you want to say anything on this?
Yeah, I mean, around Scotland, there are a variety of different ways that local authorities and other statutory organisations fund, support and assist community transport. And none of them are perfect and none of them are wrong. The strength of community transport is that it is so diverse and that it fits what the community need. And I think that the people around this table at the moment acknowledge that and try and work with it. I would think my only concrete statement on it would be that to impose a set way of doing it would just be very detrimental.
That leads nicely on to Alex's questions.
My first question has been informed by much of the information we've had already, because I've heard Councillor Phillips talk about the fact that it needs to be a bottom-up arrangement. I've heard Mr Stewart talk about the fact that one size doesn't fit all. We've heard others on the panel make similar comments in some detail. But previous witnesses who've come forward have actually said that they support calls for the development of a national community transport strategy. Are the two things inconsistent?
I think a strategy is fine to the extent that we need to define the outcomes we're trying to achieve and means by which we might achieve them. When you're into operational delivery, however, you really don't want to be doing that from the centre. And I think at the point you are looking at a community where you're looking at what the community's needs are, the social outcomes you want to try and achieve, then that conversation is best handled locally. So I think strategically we need to recognise that we need to take accessibility, connectivity, access to facilities of a general nature broadly available across the whole spectrum. That's a national issue, and so is funding, by the way. But when it comes to what are we going to do in this particular place, you can't do it from the centre. I could give you an example. We have a variety of communities where the issue is quite simply distance from the centre, where the issue is just absence of transport. But you can actually start to, I'm thinking of places like Durness and Tongue and Kinloch Burvey on the northwest side, where you're saying access to medical facilities, very difficult. If you are ill in any urgent way, you are more vulnerable than you would be in an urban centre because it just takes so much longer for anything to get to you. Where survival of the community itself is a questionable issue. There are always villages that are hanging on, but the most important thing you can do is put in a community bus of some sort, and that just gets people out and around and connecting and mobile. But you can find yourself, and you took evidence from Badenoch and Strathspey in a previous session, you can find yourself by accident funding activities that were not in the original transport specifications. So you look locally rather than nationally at the operation that you're invited to fund. You understand what's going on, you look at its overheads, and you start asking questions if you think they're too high, as we did in that particular case. And you find you're cross-subsidising other activities, which are laudable, but we didn't intend to fund from the transport budget. And in taking that into account and reducing the fund that we put into that particular activity, we were able to find funding for 5 more organisations in the last budgetary settlement. So I think the local understanding is vital to making it work at all. If you tried to do it from here, you really wouldn't understand the operations that you were dealing with. You wouldn't be able to understand the complexity, the local variety, and you really wouldn't be able to respond in an effective way at the local level.
Thank you very much. I think the local content and the variability of different areas is an important feature, albeit that SPT happens by size of population to look after about 42% of the Scottish population, around 60% of public transport trips, and looking after 12 authorities. So we have endeavoured to provide a framework, this network, which is, we've passed that in the quality framework. But that's not to say that should be a national agency that ministers community transport. I think that we would find difficulty, because even in our own area, we have the situation where in North Lanarkshire, their requirements are unique and different. In South Lanarkshire, particularly huge areas of, whilst it's in a conurbation, there's huge areas that are very, very rural. And in North Lanarkshire, we're looking at things like school meals, whereas you go not so far away, you go into the Isle of Arran, which has got a huge problem in trying to come up with a solution that brings in community transport. You have a ferry arriving where you need a double-decker practically, but the rest of the year you can do it practically with a very small bus. So I don't think there is a single... we've endeavoured to put in our own content regionally, our kind of national framework, but that's not to define how you deliver the car service or the bus service. That we engage with elected members through the partnership board and with the community transport groups, and we don't have a pro forma of this is how you deliver community transport. We'll look into each individual bid and whatever's appropriate. So we see that there might be a national need for a framework in terms of reasonable quality and good governance without it being onerous, because you would stymie the whole sense of community transport with volunteering and everything that comes along with it. But there might be an opportunity to have a national set of reasonable standards, but the delivery has to be done very much in a local content, certainly in our experience. Thank you.
Mr. Berry.
Well, I would almost like to advocate that you have a think about the idea of a top-down approach in respect of a particular element, a strand of community transport, which is community car schemes. The community car schemes, I think, are generally the most likely area of growth in the community transport sector, because what we're talking about is people here volunteering to drive their own car and taking other people around in return for a mileage payment, which is currently in the region of 45p a mile. And I say that because that is what the Inland Revenue recognises as a mileage rate that's acceptable for reimbursement without actually somebody making a profit. In the evidence that ATCO submitted, there was an appendix there, Appendix 2 to our work, which is something that I've been discussing and thinking about quite a lot, about how we could change community transport provision across Scotland. I mentioned earlier on about it being a patchwork. There are some areas of Scotland which have got great public transport, great community transport. It's established, it's got going, but there's other areas where there's nothing. The other issue I have with community transport is there's a sense that people don't really understand it. Community transport is a really quite a difficult concept to get your head around. Am I allowed to use it? Where can I get it from? Who do I phone? It's a kind of service that people don't really know very well, unless they've used it before or they've really been signposted into it. And like I say, in some communities, they might say, oh, we've got a fantastic car scheme in Blair Gowrie, or we've got something, and everybody knows about it. But generally, I think there's a lack of understanding of what the concept of community transport is and how you access it. Now, in the submission that we gave from ATCO, and I'll admit that it was mostly penned by me, I advocated an approach that would be almost like a national brand for volunteer driving, a national brand with national conditions, so that everyone would be doing roughly the same thing. Not roughly the same thing, very much the same thing in terms of things like vetting, in terms of mileage reimbursement rates. And this would hopefully attract people who are in the ability to use their cars to offer trips. And I think there is a real financial incentive for people to become volunteers, as well as the benefit of being a volunteer for social sort of altruistic reasons. There's a real financial incentive here as well, because running a car is obviously in rural areas is not a cheap thing to do, and you need, it costs you thousands of pounds to keep your car on the road, especially if you're going lots of miles. Now, if you get paid a mileage allowance, some of that money can be then used to offset your standing costs, your fixed costs of owning and running a car. So owning a car and buying the car in the first place is a big part of car ownership. The fuel cost and the wear and tear is a fairly small part of it. So these 45p a mile, if you take somebody 50 miles or 100 miles round trip, you're going to get 45 quid back for doing that. That's quite an attractive thing. And I think I would advocate there is a pretty radical approach that could be done from a top-down direction that said, across Scotland we could have a network of volunteer drivers who abide by the same rules and make themselves available. And I would say it would need to be well branded and advertised. You're advertising for volunteer drivers to come in, but you're also selling the product and saying to people who might use the service, this exists. There's lots of people out there who don't really understand or don't know how they can tap into community transport. And I would say there is potential for a top-down approach in that area, community cars. I wouldn't go as far to say there's a top-down approach on minibuses and minibus operations, but in community car schemes, volunteer drivers running their own cars, I think there is potential to look at that. And I would, I saw the sheer volume of submissions you got for this inquiry, but I would recommend you could have a look at that and see where I'm going from if you wanted to explore that idea.
Where do I start on this one? National strategy, I actually, I tend to agree that there is a need for a national strategy on community transport. My colleagues at Lothian Community Transport Services put in their written submission to you actually 4 points or 5 points that a national strategy would do, and I would ask you to have a quick look at that, because I think it covers the basics, ideas of where I think we would like to see the strategy there. So I'm going to completely disagree with the idea of nationalising car schemes, because I think that would come under re-regulation of bus services. We might as well just rip it all up and start again. I think we covered earlier the comments that the communities should be free to do what they need to do. Yes, perhaps as part of the national strategy, there should be quality guidelines. I totally agree with that. Now, quality guidelines goes for everything, whether it's a car scheme, a bus scheme, and, it should be written into that national strategy. Also, what should be written into the national strategy, hopefully, should be funding, so that we don't just have a nice, pretty pink and fluffy brochure that says, this is our strategy, how you do it, don't care, but this is the national strategy, this is what we're going to give each local authority or statutory organisation in order to encourage them to do it, and these are your guidelines.
Interesting range of views. That will keep us thinking for a while. Before I The one other thing I wanted to ask, and this is really about the submission that came from the Association of Transport Coordinating Officers, and that is, you raised the issue of monitoring and evaluating social and economic value of community transport. Can you explain why this might be necessary and how it might be achieved?
Sure, thanks. One of the things that we're often talking about is funding. You know, we maybe as local authorities are the funders, or the NHS might be the funders, and the community transport groups saying, you know, can we have some money? Can we develop our services? So there's often dialogue about how we fund services and what we're, and as funders, we want to know kind of what we're getting back. I think there is a national approach to even measuring journeys is something that we really need to maybe adopt, because, for example, if I said I've come to Edinburgh today, you might say, well, that's one trip. Well, I might say, well, actually, I've got to go back to Dundee this afternoon. I've done 2 trips. So people measure things in completely different ways, you know, and we don't really have, at this stage, a real feel for the quantity of trips that are being undertaken across Scotland. And there are so many schemes, some very well known to us, some under the radar, like little, you know, friends of the church, or who take trips on a Sunday morning. Do you count them? So, you know, trying to count and monitor the quantity is really important. And then trying to put a value on that. We often talk about the social return on investment. You know, what do you get back? We talk about people maybe being able to stay in their homes longer if they have access to good transport. You know, they don't then end up in a care home maybe a year in advance of what they have, and all the extra costs. And so what I was really putting out there was, it's really important to have a good feel for the quantity of the number of trips that are being undertaken. And I think some groups are very good at measuring that and can say straight away, you know, we did 77,000 trips last year. But we also need to have a better understanding of how we, you know, value that. I know that Highland Council commissioned consultants, Derek Halden consultants, to look at that very issue. And I think that's probably valuable work. But I mean, you know, trying to, in that whole idea of looking at the value of community transport, you know, we have to also understand what it does for people beyond just the actual trip itself, if that makes sense.
Is there a danger that, well, inevitably there'll be a cost associated with this, but is there a danger that community transport operators themselves might find that there's a cost attached to this, either financially or in the time taken by volunteers, for example? To record the number of trips, I do not think would be a massively onerous task on any community transport organisation to say, you know, we did. But my point really was maybe making sure that everybody records it in the same way. So if you have taken somebody to the hospital, you record that as either 1 or 2 trips. You know, it's a return trip. But, you know, we need to, because some group might say, I've done twice as many trips as another group. And then when you're looking at it, you might say, well, they did 10,000 trips last year. They did 5,000 trips last year. There's no sort of even a uniform approach to measuring and counting trips. So I think having an approach where people count in the same way is very important. And I don't think it would be onerous on any community transport group to try and keep a record of that. I think the vast majority of them probably already do it. Certainly those who are being funded will have to, I would think.
It's Rachel and Mr. Simon.
Going to the counting of trips, it is very important, and John's right, it's not onerous to do. However, we shouldn't be looking at whether one group is better because they did 10,000 trips or one group is better because they did 5,000, because those 5,000 trips are just as important to the clients in those communities. Also could be that one person is needing to go 60 miles round trip for a 3-hour hospital appointment. That's just as important as 10 clients going out for their shopping. So they all need to be viewed on a social return as well as a financial return. One of the conversations I had with some of my colleagues around the CT groups around Scotland was that what would be helpful is almost a negative impact assessment. What's the cost of not providing the community transport? You know, what is the cost to the social network? What's the cost to the health centre? One of my colleagues sent me some figures through yesterday, basically saying an annual bus pass in most cities in the UK is about 650. Some of the costs for bringing a doctor in, bringing a nurse in, home help, Meals on Wheels, missed hospital appointments, we could be doubling that. And I think that If we are going to look at the value of community transport, we need to do it as a whole, holistic approach and look at the value of us to everyone, whether it's a social worker, whether it's the NHS, because this is an all-round problem for the whole of our communities, not just the elderly person at home. That impacts on their family members. That impacts right down to a 5-year-old child going to school. So we need to be looking at the all-round costs there.
I should say that we're trying to take a holistic approach insofar as the Health and Sport Committee are looking at particular health aspects of community transport. Later on this month, they're taking an evidence session, and we have had rural affairs involved as well. So, yes, Mr. Summers.
Yeah, I agree very much with Rachel and with John on the wider benefits, and I used the phrase "the cost of not doing." The research that John referred to was High Trans rather than Highland Council, and there was a brief summary of findings at the back of our submission. That was very much seen as a toe in the water, as a first step to measuring that, because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of the kind of benefits that other speakers have mentioned, but very little hard evidence. And if community transport is saving health service, for example, money, whether it be missed appointments or higher level care, or whether it's enabling people to take up employment, then these are things that are not nearly as easily measured as the number of journeys, but they're very, very important in understanding why it's there. There are some councils where there's been significant cuts in community transport funding recently, including at least one of the projects that was covered in the High Trans study, and it might actually be interesting to revisit that and measure the negative cost, as Rachel put it. This is also an area that could, I think, be looked at nationally in continuing that research. Now, it might be joint project between the RTPs, or it might be at national, say, Transport Scotland level, but in research rather than in details of in individual schemes, there could be a national opportunity there.
Okay. Right. Did you want to come in on this, Margaret? No. Okay. Gordon.
Ms. Convener, I want to move on to the subject of vehicle purchase and replacement. In a previous evidence session, we heard from Lothian Community Transport, who stated that the lack of capital funding for vehicle replacement is threatening the continued existence of some community transport groups. And Mr. Stewart, you touched upon some of the support that SPT gives to the sector, but I'm keen to understand, you know, the level of support across the country for the purchase of community vehicles.
Yes, Councillor Phillips.
Well, I've read the evidence that's been given before. I agree the fleet is ageing. I agree that community transport groups need a longer-term horizon than they currently have. We mentioned in our written submission the Kinloch-Bervie-based group, which decided not to buy a second bus, for which they had an admirable business case, because they couldn't see themselves as a going concern more than 2 years ahead. We are exploring whether, as a council, we could acquire vehicles and lease them to the CT groups and take that burden off them. Now, that's something that we have to look at within our own budgetary process, and we know we have very substantial further public sector spending cuts coming down in a couple of years' time, so we're going to have to be very careful what we commit to. But we're certainly anxious to look at that and see if that's a way to take the burden of, you know, big hit capital purchases off the CT groups. I saw there was an objection in the general sense to leasing from the CT sector in the previous evidence. I don't see why that should be.
It's just that they couldn't, because they couldn't guarantee long-term funding.
Well, yeah, okay. That does bring us then to the point that we need a longer-term funding horizon. Everybody needs to see 5, 6, 7 years forwards. And I really don't see... why we couldn't. If indeed we do acquire a national strategy for this sort of transport provision, then it should be possible to plan strategically for the financing of it as well. And that would allow us to put things onto a more stable footing. And I think that's where the strategy question and the funding question can come together.
Excluding the leasing subject itself, does Highland Council provide any capital funding to groups in the area to help purchase vehicles?
Well, up until perhaps I'd better ask David to answer that, because he's actually been doing this for longer than I have.
Our grant scheme that we run was largely inherited from the previous Rural Community Transport Initiative that was Transport Scotland. It wasn't Transport Scotland, it was Scottish Government. And that was open to capital and revenue. Most of our funding is revenue, but there are occasions where we've done some capital contributions.
Thank you. When I made the earlier reference to lease, that was simply about this of the legal, the control of it. It's, the vehicle is gifted. It's not a chargeable lease that we've done. We've actually granted the vehicle at no cost, and we do a mix of both capital and revenue support where it's appropriate, even to the point of making a contribution towards a people carrier, if that's the right solution. Now, where the scheme, the vehicles have to be monitored to be maintained properly, and again, trying to make the difference between a very heavy maintenance regime and if it says it's bought from Arnold Clark and they say, have it maintained every 10,000 miles, well, please do so. That's the kind of level of control. But we have put about 7 or 8 vehicles into community transport schemes, and we're talking through CTA just now about some vehicles that we've been using on more mainstream contracts, but probably finding that particular type of vehicle we were working too hard. But if it was a lighter duty cycle, some of these buses we were ending up that we were going to forecast to do 200,000 miles in 18 months, and that's maybe a bit heavy for the type of vehicle. So already speaking to Rachel's colleague to gift these buses to replace more elderly vehicles, and they will be, and we'll put a support package, so we're not putting a burden onto an individual. So where it's appropriate, we will access capital to either gift a vehicle, and if that vehicle is used, and then there's more need than there is buses, so we don't really have a problem to say that that's lasts for 2 years. Am I going to be stuck with the bus? No way. But we will always find a home for the vehicles, because there is so many gaps needing to be plugged. So we'll do either revenue support or provide a vehicle if that's the request. And in the odd cases where we've actually wanted specifically to plug a gap, we've suggested that they take the bus and we give some revenue support. Because the bottom line is, if the mainstream bus operator wants to do it, well, wire on in. So we're never in that contentious issue.
Just to be clear, is it the case that you purchase the vehicle and then lease it to the community groups at, say, no charge or whatever, or is it, why don't SPT, given the long-term nature of the organisation, lease vehicles from a supplier and then lease them onto community groups?
We tend not to lease vehicles. We tend to procure them and continue to use them. But we will also grant fund the community group to buy if it's more appropriate for them. So we don't have a strict formula on, but we don't tend. At the moment, we own around 108 vehicles which are given out on my bus contracts, the demand responsive contracts, or on subsidised bus contracts, and we own them, and we have a replacement programme. So either 350,000 miles or within 7 years, we will schedule to continue. And there's other reasons for that. It's about moving the quality threshold up generally, because sometimes we are placing contracts under the procurement rules, and you don't really have that ability to define the bus. So you have old high floor vehicles, whereas we have a policy of bringing in low floor vehicles. So we've taken some of that policy and applied it to community transport. But we, as a policy, we buy the vehicle, run it over 7 or 350,000 miles, and then we'll replace it after that. And it has moved if we do monitoring of the number of low floor Euro derivative, the emission standards, and our 108 vehicles were actually bigger than some operators, and that investment has actually moved the bar up in terms of Euro compliance. So there's other wee spin-off benefits from the public sector making that investment in the vehicle. It does lift the quality threshold bar. So it's taken around. It's not a specific one fit all. That's it.
Rachel.
Leasing in general is not a problem. Across Scotland, CT groups are quite happy to lease. The issue on it, well, there's a couple. One, it's a full culture change to us. Many small community groups are used to the old RCTI, the Rural Community Transport Initiative, way of just grant funding. And that's what we're used to doing, finding our own money, buying that bus outright, and then knowing you only have the maintenance costs to go for. However, I mean, one of my buses is 13 years old. The other side of that is the spec. Who leases these vehicles? If it's Highland Council, do they then create one specification? Now that in itself leads to all sorts of problems because, for instance, Aberdeenshire Council put on Opteraleros for some of their runs. Beautiful buses if you're running in the city, dreadful buses if you're running in the country. Just won't get up farm tracks, ground out, you know, they're just awful. So who makes that spec up? On our own service, our own organisation up in Buchan, I actually have, including the MPV, I was just doing a quick head count, 4 different specifications of buses. Because I've got some in Aberdeen City and some doing different groups. And they may need 1 or 2 wheelchairs. They may need, you know, different handholds depending on the client group. And although you can create a spec that covers the most of it, you can't make it really community transport generic, you know. So capital funding is vitally important, vitally important. Lothian's right, and I've sat in meetings with John where the two of us are going, yeah, I've got a bus that's going, he's got a bus that's going, and I can understand why some groups just are looking at shutting the doors because they just can't afford it. Buses are costing anything from 39 to 50,000 to replace. It's a lot of money for a small group.
You can lease vehicles one at a time. I don't see any reason to impose a spec on anybody. I think it will emerge from a sensible conversation with the group in question and what their ambitions were, what kind of a service they needed to offer. So I actually don't think that we have a practical problem as long as we behave in a sensible manner. The reason that we are looking at leasing at the moment is that we recognise that we have buses which are ageing and they have to be replaced. We've been trying to fund more groups for their operating costs rather than fund fewer groups to build vehicle replacement funds, because we've been very, very keen to spread the service as widely as we can. But we know that's led us to the point where we have to think about leasing and support for that as the next step.
Okay, yeah, the Rural Community Transport Initiative that some of you touched upon, when it was closed, the funding was rolled into the local authority block grant, and local authorities were required to honour the Scottish Government's ongoing funding commitments to Rural Community Transport Initiative projects following the Government's scheme closure. And I'm just keen to understand how the level of local authority funding has changed since the scheme closed in 2008.
Mr. Berry, do you want to start?
I think this is an area I think hopefully we'll have a bit of unanimity on, in as much as that RCTI and its urban equivalent, which was UCTI, Urban Community Transport, I mean, because the money was ring-fenced, it was really good news for the community transport sector. As soon as Concordat came in and the money got given over to local authorities to decide as they would, it was almost inevitable that if not today, if not this year, next year, over the number of the years, it would get chipped away at. I mean, obviously, since 2007, the whole budgetary issue has changed, and perhaps RCTI and UCTI might have been on a sugly peg anyway with the budgetary and constraints that we have now. But certainly, with the money coming over to local authorities, there was always a danger that when it came to decision making, more statutory responsibilities like social work and education would be seen as a more pressing priority than supporting community transport. And I would say across the board, across the local authorities, yes, there has been a chipping away at the money that is now being given over to the CT sector. And it is a shame because you know, I mean, ring fencing definitely had that benefit of saying this is for this specific purpose. I fear that what we've seen in the last sort of 6 years, and we'll go on to see, is that, you know, just chipping away at the community transport budgets. And, you know, I would imagine the community transport people would love it if ring fencing returned and we said, this is a budget for that particular purpose.
Mr. Stewart.
Whilst I accept that's probably generally true, I can, without having the figures absolutely at hand, I can say our investment in community transport has increased since RCTI came across, because it is becoming a pragmatic solution, and it's actually now formed itself into part of something that we would consider in the overall spread of how you actually start to address market needs and community needs. So, and that's not just in bus provision, in case you think I'm heavily labouring on that, because that's a big focus, obviously, but in car schemes. So I would say that we have increased our investment in that, but I accept John saying that generally there must be strains right across the area. But it sounds as though we're kind of really nice. It's because it's fulfilling a need. We're, you know, it's part of a solution. So we're not, you know, in the game of putting more investment in without getting a return. It's a practical solution.
Is there any reason why other local authorities, as Mr. Berry suggested, isn't seeing the benefits by investing in community transport?
I go back to that idea that I think community transport is a difficult concept to get your head round. If you say, let's save a bus service, you know, politicians can rally to saving a bus service. If you say, let's save, you know, a community transport service, it's more a difficult thing to get around, and people won't campaign perhaps in the same way for it, whatever, you know. And I think there is a danger. It's the kind of like Cinderella service, and because it's that kind of Cinderella service, it'll just get forgotten about, put to one side. The ugly sisters of public transport and taxi industry will be there getting all the glory, getting all the funding, and Cinderella will be sitting there saying, what about me? And, you know, that's the difficulty. It's a difficult idea to get your head around community transport. I've been watching too many pantomimes. So.
I think if there had been a focus on outcomes, and you mentioned it, Councillor Phillips, that out of your transport budget, you might have difficulty, but that's the problem, that councils are not focusing on outcomes and the well-being of their communities and their citizens by just looking at it in budgetary terms rather than focusing on the outcomes. But is it Mr. Summers, you want to come in on this?
Yes, thank you. I was going to revert to the question about RCTI and post-RCTI funding. When RCTI was wound up, there were some agreements that ended, there were 3-year or 2-year agreements, whatever they were, but they ended at the time when RCTI itself finished, and there were others that had an ongoing commitment. And the money was handed over to the councils for those that had an ongoing commitment, but not for the grants that were ending, although the needs were going to be still there. As Rachel said in her written submission, what is your exit strategy? We don't have one because the needs are all going to be there. So in Highland's case, the council found from their own resources the money to replace the schemes where the previous agreements had ended, as well as continuing the ongoing ones. Now that budget has declined since then, but haven't got the exact figure with me from 2008, but we're still around the same level of funding as what was handed over from RCTI, but we did have the uplift for some time.
Mr. Stewart and then Rachel.
Thank you. If I can give an example for me, and this was sort of publicly reported, that we've made use of community transport, and just to show the economics of it, where the best price I could get for using a mainstream bus operator for some early morning, late evening trips to, and there was a hospital for workers involved, was £72,000, and we delivered that using a community transport scheme in East Ayrshire, very well-known scheme. We provided the bus and we provide the operating cost, and it was £24,000. So that's the answer to the question. Thank you.
You mentioned outcomes, and I think one of the, I probably risk getting slapped from one of these guys, but I think one of the issues with councils is that they are looking at the majority of their clients. CT operates by its nature for the minority, the very, very small amount of people who fall through the sieve of community transport, of taxi card and all the rest of it. We catch them. And therefore, they're the ones that are easiest to ignore. So, yeah, Cinderella's right. You know, we are the Cinderella of, I like that, I'm going to adopt it, Cinderella of the transport industry. And I think that that's what makes it so much harder for local authorities to justify funding us. And until something like that negative impact assessment is done, they will never have the weapons to go to their accounts department and say, well, actually, no, we need a couple of 100,000, because it doesn't cost much to fund us, but it's if on one hand you have 200,000 looking for, you know, your granny's bus, and your children aren't getting their school books, which one is a councillor going to vote for? You know, it's a no-brainer.
So Philip.
I'm going to upset Rachel and agree again. We really do get it, actually. And we're taking a paper to my committee tomorrow, actually, proposing a research project which is going to try and quantify the social benefits of CT. And the proposition is to have a community which doesn't currently have a scheme and put a scheme in and try it for a year and measure the difference it makes. I think you have to do a little bit of lab work sometimes. I'm also aware of work which was done by the Nordic Council in collaboration with the EU, looking at the question of infrastructure investment in remote rural communities. And they discovered that there is a tangible, measurable migration into rural areas if you put certain things in place. Now, I was looking at that work originally from a roads infrastructure and a telecoms perspective, but I'm going to go back to it and see what I can learn from it on the perspective of public transport and CT, and see if there's anything that we can bring into that, because the work was done by University of the Highlands and Islands, actually, for Nordic Council. And if there is anything that I can find in that, I will pass it to you so you can take it into account. But I think we should be learning from all these bits of work that have been going on.
Okay, yep.
And just one last question. Highland Council has suggested that the Scottish Government takes responsibility for a vehicle replacement fund, which would be conditional on wider community availability. I'm just keen to understand if that's got widespread support, how would it operate, who would administer it, and what would the level of funding required, bearing in mind there's, 300 minibuses on the road for community transport?
We provide £417,000 a year for community transport, and it's spread very thin. We've already been discussing that vehicle replacement is an issue. If we support, a community comes to us with a proposition for support and they bring us their entire operating model, what their costs are, what their likely income streams are, and we look at whether we think it's viable and how we can support it. If leasing costs are added onto that, it's money taken out of the cash that we could be giving to other groups where we might like to expand to support new schemes, and where we'd be just aiming at the operating costs, the maintenance, the payment of drivers perhaps, and those sorts of things, fuel costs and so on. So every time we look at a new scheme, we say, what's the total capital cost? What's the total operating cost? Where's your income? What's the subsidy you need to keep it going? We need to factor in there any shortfall, perhaps if they're doing Section 22, we need to start modelling in any detriment that arises from the 60% reimbursement rate. If, you know, there was a case quoted by John Moore in your previous session of a 95% usage by people on concessionary fares. That can leave you with a very substantial shortfall in revenue. So we need to look at the whole operating model. If we could take vehicle replacement out of the equation, but still maintain the operational funding that we have, we could support far more groups. And I'm certain that we could double the number of groups that we support across the Highland Council area without anybody noticing, without anybody feeling there was over-provision anywhere. Because if you consider a map of the Highland Council area, think of the A9, the A96 and the A82 as a cross going down to Fort William. You get off those routes very far, there's no public transport at all, thousands of square miles, thousands of people with absolutely no access to meaningful public transport of any sort. There are huge gaps. You are researching gaps yourselves, so are we. That's the next job that we've got to do because we're trying to quantify the size of the gaps. Any help that we can get from central government to support any of this will be gratefully received. Now, we're aware of the criticisms from Audit Scotland of the duplication that there exists, where, you know, there are NHS vehicles and ambulance service vehicles and school bus vehicles and community transport, and there's a lot of duplication, and the suggestion was that vehicles could be used more efficiently. We're alive to that. I told you about the Loch Harbour pilot that we're about to get going, where we're going to pool all those vehicles and a community group is going to handle the bookings, so we will try and get more bums on more seats more often, more flexibly and more cost effectively. And that's something that we're looking at from a tactical perspective to see if we can use our assets better. But there is still one heck of a shortfall between what we currently have and what we could reasonably provide to bring very fragile communities up to a meaningful level. And what gets me up in the morning isn't having a community transport scheme or running a council budget. It's actually trying to reverse the population decline in my county, stop young people moving out because they have to, stop old people going into care homes early and maybe 40, 50 miles away because there's nothing in their area. We want stable, sustainable communities in places where, to be honest, transport funding doesn't reach. So any help, gratefully received. Thank you.
Sorry, Rachel and then John.
Sorry, John. Vehicle provision and maximising use of resources is a great idea. Aberdeenshire Council tries to do it. I was reading their submission this morning, and they have 60 minibus in total and 316 hires overall to non-council affiliated groups. That's only 5 per bus. That's vastly under use of resources there. Our own buses are used by all sorts of community groups, whether they are the local guides, whether it's sheltered housing, across as long as they are a community group and they can prove that. The issues I have with a council, for instance, providing a vehicle and saying, right, this is, you know, you have to use it by everyone, is how do you monitor that? How is it managed by the permit system? Because we have the permits, the Section 19 permits for the vehicles. The groups must be our members, and therefore we can monitor the quality and making sure that we're within the law there. If a council has that and just saying, well, no, you have to use them, then we work on, you know, who's got the right, and the organisation who owns that bus or who's running that bus has the responsibility in the long run. So that is a major problem. There's also the issue of potential private hires getting in and therefore coming against the commercial sector. We're very careful, and as are the community groups, the community transport groups in general, not to alienate the commercial operators. If there's a wedding party, well, that's private hire. It needs to go out. If it's a local knitting group going to the museum, it's community hire. It's very delineated. Whereas if we were being told by the council, well, you have to open them, who basically watches that?
just on the cost side of it, I think you asked how much might it cost. I'm going to give you a figure. £1.5 million would pay for the renewal of 300 minibuses on an 8-year cycle. I'm basing that on Rachel's figure of about £40,000 for a minibus. So if you take that over 8 years, that's £5,000 a year. 300 minibuses times £5,000 a year is, if I've done my sums right, £1.5 million. So in the capital spend of the government, I mean, that would go, you know, you obviously have a transport spend. A lot of it money goes on to things like building bridges and rail. And, you know, this is a really vital service that we think, you know, makes a real impact on people's lives locally. And for a fairly small amount of money, £1.5 million, I'm going to say, in the big picture, you know, you could effectively say we could have 300 minibuses operating in these key rural communities across Scotland, because I think that is where the issue is at its greatest. It's in rural communities. If you said, do I want 3 minibuses for Dundee, I would probably say no, because of that very issue that Rachel's just highlighted. Aberdeen City Council have got 60 minibuses and they're only getting used 5 times a year. You know, there's underutilisation of some buses that belong to councils, and therefore in cities, but in other communities there's a desperate need for a minibus. So in a rural village or a rural community, having a minibus on tap is really quite an advantage. And I reckon, like I say, if you're looking at 300 buses for Scotland, on that 8-year cycle, it would cost £1.5 million a year.
Thank you. Just to pick up on Rachel's points, they are issues that she's raised. The pilot that we're running in Loch Arbour, it's a joint operation, the community at the heart of it. The work plan has been put together jointly by the community, ourselves, the NHS and the SAS. Those are the issues that we're actually looking at sorting out. We recognise that those are issues we have to deal with. The point of the pilot is to work out how you do it and learn from it. You raised in the previous session the question of insurance, where different groups go. Those are problems you fix, for heaven's sake. And all of the organisations are coming together with a mindset to do that. And I think we have to let them work out where the problems are, capture the data, and see what we can roll out elsewhere. Because if it works, it'll be terrific.
Okay, we need to move on. Gil.
Well, thanks very much, Convener. Can I make an observation? First, Rachel Milne mentioned that she's going to adopt Cinderella. It looks as if you've got your colleagues as Prince Charmings, because no, they seem to be on your side here. They seem to be agreeing with you. But on costs, one of the pressure points or the barriers is the D1 licence. That we've already had evidence from others on this and how it impacts on the training of volunteers. And I wonder if you have any views on the capacity of organisations like councils or national authorities or even big transport operators, if they could assist in that, or if indeed some are assisting in this area.
Mr. Stewart.
Thank you. One of the aspects we're trying to develop is to look at the PSP, the development of the partnership, the social enterprise model. And the D1 licence has been highlighted as a fundamental future risk to the community transport sector. What we're trying to do is bring as many partners as we sensibly can into that whilst we might be able to source a vehicle and might be able to fund some training. If you go privately to get that licence now, I think it's £500, £600, £700, £800 have you got to double that. There you go, it's double that. It's a very expensive proposition. But this will not be a panacea, but what we're trying to do is use this social enterprise model, and we've already spoken to some of the big bus companies that they see an end game there, that if we work along with somebody, maybe starts a volunteer, bring them through the D1 licence, bring them through to a PCV, that they will guarantee an interview at the end of it. It's not guarantee a job, but at least they will have a process where somebody's moved. And that's a matter of choice. It will not suit everybody. People maybe just want to be a car scheme volunteer, but there'll be the odd opportunities where people will want to actually continue through to better employment. And it's ones and twos, but at least it's a starting place. And we will, through this model, we will find ourselves in a position that we will fund a vehicle and give some additional funding for a trainer. Now, the trainer will be done over a much more protracted period than if you go and pay your £800 or £1,500 to get it from a private sector provider. So it'll be done, you'll be delivering community transport services if it's a car scheme. If you need the D1 licence, and I believe it's now even complicated with the weight of the vehicle and the tail lift, it gets more complex. So because, again, sounding, I don't know if it was Prince Charming or the ugly sister you're referring to, that there's an end game for us, and that's getting more resource to provide that pool so that we can make use of it, and equally what the community, in the round where the benefits to the community. So that's one area we are keen to see if we can develop something to provide some D1 training in the west of Scotland to bring people through, so they're not critically dependent, having to spend a big pile of money, because there is, there's a bit of collaboration, and we can all take firm positions on it, but this is not a fixed formula. Community transport is developing and emerging, and we're finding our feet in certain areas, and that's one thing that's come relatively new, that D1 is going to be a longer term problem to the sector. So we'd certainly in the SBT area look at providing some assistance to small scale. We're not going to provide the replacement for thousands of people to go and save themselves £1,500, but we will provide some kind of support along that way. And it's something that's been worked up just now, so we don't have absolute clarity on it, but it's an area we do believe is a matter of concern.
Your question, before I move on to someone else, when you're providing this, is there a criteria that you're going to set up so that the point that you make, that you're going to be trying to avoid training people that are seeking a back door to employment rather than assist where this pressure point is training volunteers? Are you going to have some criteria set up that the clientele will come through the voluntary sector?
That's certainly the idea behind it. It's been driven by people who have spent a lifetime in the voluntary sector, that this is where that need is. So we don't have a criteria. This is a very good point you make, but these are the things that we are working just now with, trying to develop this social enterprise model, and something I believe that is of interest to the Scottish Government elsewhere to keep advancing these opportunities. And the final part of the process was speaking to the private sector. Would they become participants in that scheme so that they could facilitate people moving through into employment? So I wasn't suggesting people would abuse the training opportunity to bail out somewhere else. It's just there's a limit to the scalability of this. There's going to be a problem. So I'm sorry I can't answer your question with what the solution is. It's something that we want to do, and we have to work through, and there's quite a number of groups engaged in it.
Thanks for that. Thanks very much.
Rachel and then Mr. Saunders.
D1 is a major issue. To expand on what Eric was saying, in order to get a D1 or to drive a vehicle without the D1, you have to be driving under 3.5 tonne or 4.25 if it's an accessible vehicle. So you have the whole vehicle weight there as well. From an organisational point of view and my own, we've actually taken the step of training a trainer in D1, so that all of our drivers are now, all of our staff drivers are all D1 trained. We will open that this year, we're into the new financial year, this year to our volunteers, anyone who wants to be trained up, but they will have to sign a contract that they'll stay with us for a year and do so many runs. However, we do have the lighter-based vehicles as well, so that we can cover everything, whether it's PSV and D1 or non-D1. From the voluntary sector's perspective, it's not just the money for it, it's the time and the fear of going through a driving test again. Because you have to do your theory, you have to do your hazard perception, you have to do your driver CPCs, and then you have to do the driving test. It's a huge amount of work. As I say, we've got drivers going through, we've got professional drivers going through that are coming to me going, I'm scared. So if a professional driver is worried about it, your average volunteer, they're going to have real issues going forward to that. So it is something, it's maybe a culture change that we have to change over time, but there's also an opportunity there. for social enterprises, for community transport organisations to build up small social enterprises providing that training. Now, ourselves and Lothian Community Transport and Stirling Dialer Journey have been in this conversation for best part of a year, because we all do D1 training of one type or another, and we're looking at, right, what can we do together? You know, this is a problem, where can we go long term? But we've just not got any further than that conversation yet. But I do see it as a huge opportunity for the CT sector to maybe start making a little bit of sustainability within reason.
Mr. Berry, you wanted to come in next. Oh, sorry. Mr. Berry, next.
D1, I think, has potential to have a pretty devastating impact on the provision of community transport with minibuses, because it is so onerous, as Rachel describes, money, time. It's going to have a massive impact on local authorities as well. All those school minibuses, all those social work minibuses, we won't be able to drive them in 10 or 20 years' time, because we won't have any staff who have got the D1 anymore, because they'll have all retired. And unless we tackle this in a joined-up way, local authorities, community transport, you know, we've got to tackle the training issue. And I think my perception is we will move away from minibuses and start doing things with PSVs and people carriers, and that will be the approach, rather than get a teacher out of school for 5 days to go through their minibus training, because it's such a big ask to spend the money and the time of people to come away from their normal job, whether it's a school teacher or whether it's a social worker, to learn to be a bus driver. So I mean, I think D1 is a really tough issue, and we're going to have to work out a strategy that covers both the community transport sector, the voluntary sector, but also local authorities as well. We need to make sure that our staff can drive minibuses. Otherwise, the 60 minibuses in Aberdeen and the 40 minibuses in Dundee, there'll be no staff left to drive them.
Mr. Summers.
In the last 2 years, but not this year, we've had leader funding from a European project which has topped up our community transport grants, and that has been available specifically for training. We put some matching funding in for training, but there was other money from leader. That was not restricted to driver training. In principle, if a small group needed a training course in bookkeeping, for example, they could have had that. But the D1 driving is the big one. We don't have a leader anymore, but we've still got some money allocated for training out of our overall 417,000. We've got 31,000, which is either for vehicle repair contingencies or training. And we deliver that through Inverness and Nairn Community Transport Forum. So we're actually supporting one of our community transport groups to do the training for the others. We don't restrict it to funded CT groups. There are other organisations, some quite small scale, some maybe not primarily in transport, but transport's an adjunct to what they do, and they need to have minibus drivers trained. And so we have a grant scheme for that. It's small, it could certainly have the potential to be expanded if money allowed that, but it is there. There's also, I think, the option that could be explored of using the same structure to train the council's own drivers. And just for our minibus drivers. And in response to what John said a minute ago about teachers going out to school to do training courses, one of the things that could conceivably come out of our Lochaber pilot is creating the case for full-time driver posts for within the local authority sector. Now, traditionally, for social care establishments, for example, you might have a driver handyman. Schools, in our case, very much a small minority, but there are some schools that have school transport provided by council vehicles. It's a janitor driver, usually. Now, if we can create enough work for a full-time post across the various different needs, then, and that could include driving that teachers are currently doing, then that becomes quite attractive. And if you're taking a school football team or rugby team, well, a minibus is the ideal size of vehicle for that. But if integrating that kind of activity along with the social care, possibly some dial a ride, these kind of things, these will be explored under the pilot, the kind of things we're looking at. talking about local authority transport, we're moving a wee bit away from community transport, but it's showing the linkages that can exist between the sectors.
Right, Elaine, if we can move on to concessionary travel, please.
Thanks very much. And we've obviously touched on funding issues in a number of responses to questions so far. So I want to specifically ask you about the assistance which can be channelled through the recipient of, or the user of community transport, rather than other methods of funding, which we've already discussed. So, for example, some local authorities may have schemes such as taxi cards, or they may have local authority funded concessionary schemes. If you're aware of those, I'd be interested in your views. Also, your views on Age Scotland's Still Waiting campaign, which seeks to extend the national concessionary fare scheme beyond the Section 22 buses. But we've also had evidence which has suggested there could be problems with that because it's based on 60% of a single adult fare. And obviously in Section 19 you don't have such a thing as a single adult fare. And there also could be issues about how the sort of technology that's required in order to claim back. So we'd welcome your views on whether or not you think that the solutions offered by Age Scotland and their Still Waiting campaign are a good idea or not. And finally, I wondered if Mr Berry's told us a bit about car schemes. Just interested in exploring that a wee bit more in terms of who pays, if you go into these sort of schemes, who actually pays the drivers, what happens about disclosure and you know, changes in the driver's insurance because they're using it in a different sort of way, or even indeed, my daughter works as a support worker at Epilepsy Scotland. There's issues about the safety of the people you're transporting and the training around that and so on. So just so you know, how is the best way to support that sort of community transport provided by car?
Who's going to start? That's a lot of questions rolled into one. Yes, yes, thank you. Who's going to have a stab at it? Mr Stewart and then Mr Summers.
Certainly John will deal more with the car aspects you were asking there because he was featuring on that. We said in our submission that we'd got concerns about the opening up of the concessionary scheme to community transport, but I think it was qualified to say if it was done in a coordinated way that if there was some kind of standards that would permit schemes to join the community the concession scheme, because that is a fixed pot, and we've got recent experience where as the level of reimbursement is reduced, then open and very public campaigns by a bus operator withdrawing services. So in the round we have to provide funding to fill that social and necessary gap. I'm not actually arguing the case, I'm saying that's what's been reported as opposed to, I'm not giving my personal opinion that's right or wrong, but they've taken the opportunity to exercise that and say, you cut the concession scheme, I'm cutting the service, and it's quite blatant, that's been the case. So again, it's the total funding pot that I think there's circumstances that community transport in Section 22 is definitely one where there's a service being delivered. But we'd have a general concern if this, because the pot is fixed, and it is not as though the pot grows, the pot just gets spread thinner. And all I'm trying to highlight is that in the round, if more access it, and we never said it shouldn't be opened up to community transport schemes, but it needs ones that have, Rachel has mentioned CTA, you need to be a member of CTA, so you've gone through reasonable checks in terms of your governance, your quality of vehicle, that you are a responsible operator. That in itself might be the threshold to say, yes, then you're eligible to claim concessionary reimbursement, but there needs to be some kind of standard to draw a line, otherwise I think it'll just get out of control, and there'll be schemes that develop that will be claiming concession. And car schemes are a very challenging one, that's why I'll let John answer that one. But we have reservations about the opening up of the scheme unless it's in a controlled way. And equally though, we haven't shied away from the fact that we would provide some support, because the Section 22 is now coming under the Traffic Commissioner and her resources are very strained, and that's something part of our submission. We said that for West of Scotland, for 42% of the population, we would provide that support to try and, I'll avoid the word regulate, but coordinate the Section 19, Section 22, so the Commissioner jobs are a wee bit easier. But services that go through the Commissioner's office might be the catalyst to say, well, that should get concession reimbursement. But an opening up, and an entire opening up, I think, in the round, that you'd open up that and something else would squeeze and we'd end up having to find more funding for bus services. Whether that's the truth or not, it's certainly the argument presented.
When we were discussing national strategy, we didn't touch on legislation, and much of the legislation that affects the centre is either the sector is either reserved or European, driver licensing, construction use, that kind of thing. Concessionary legislation is a devolved matter. It's community transport covers a kind of grey area as far as our ability to provide a concessionary scheme is concerned. We've taken the view that the Act says we as councils can do it for public transport services. And if it's something like our subsidised taxi contracts, which are open to the general public, then they can be covered. And we do, from the council, support these when they're not in the national scheme. Community transport, particularly car schemes, if they operate on a membership list, as many of them do, are at least arguably not public transport, and therefore we have no power to provide a concessionary scheme. Now, not everyone has taken the same interpretation, but that's the position that we've had. Amongst our own car schemes, there's probably differences in opinion on it. Some of them would like the scheme to be included. Some would feel that they could be overwhelmed with more demand than they could cope with. The users, this is quotes, the users appreciate what the volunteers are doing and want to pay something, unquote. Concessionary scheme, of course, doesn't have to be a free scheme. Then we could get into matters of eligibility, and Councillor Phillips and I were discussing this in the train on the way down. Should we be providing concessionary travel for car schemes regardless of purpose? At least if it's a bus, it's constrained to what the bus timetable is. It's not an easy one. It's worth exploring, but it's not difficult. And finally, the finance. Our concessionary budget is overspent at the moment, and that's really because of growth in demand on the train and ferry services where we provide it. Providing for car schemes would be another funding issue, funding pressure.
Rachel.
Concessions is, as David says, a very, very hard one. I've got my own personal views, which I'm going to shelve to one side and look at the CTA side and the Scottish side at the moment. It's one of those areas that we need to remember that concessions are not a grant fund for bus companies. It is a fund for users. It is for the end user. That's what a concessionary card is. It's for the client to get out. How that is then managed is open to an awful lot of debate. There are issues for community transport operations, whether they are bus schemes or car schemes. Car schemes are, taxi firms don't get access to concessions, therefore should car schemes. I'm not saying anything, I'm just posing the question. But there are issues for back office costs. There are issues on the costs of the ticket machines, the upkeep. We're looking at sort of £10,000 for one bus route for a community transport operator. Even a small to medium as we are, we couldn't afford that. We get that help from Aberdeenshire Council. If we were going down that route, we'd get the help from Aberdeenshire Council, who'd provide the back office scheme to us, which is great. What Aberdeenshire Council do are slightly similar to Highland is the fact that they have a discretionary concession scheme which is offered to any Section 19 bus operator, and that is managed by them and checked and made sure that you are doing what you should be doing, but it's easy to operate and it's easy for them to manage as well. To an extent, should community transport be open to concessions? Well, what does your end user need? At the end of the day, the concessionary fare scheme is for the end user, not for the bus companies. Oh, I'm going to move now to, if I can, to car schemes, because we've forgotten about car schemes. Car schemes, great things. insurance you asked about. When you're operating as a volunteer driver for a car scheme, we have a piece of paper that basically says this driver is driving for Dialer Community Bus under voluntary conditions. They give it to their insurance company and they're just ticked off, and they don't have to normally increase the premium. If they do, then they come back to us and we get in touch with the insurance company and they soon back off, because it's just daft to expect a premium on that one. When you're dealing with a car scheme, PVGs, yes, very important. PVGs is another issue across community transport which is causing problems, in the fact that certain services you're asking for a PVG to ensure that your clients are safe and to ensure your driver's safe, and they're saying actually you don't need one because the client is quite capable of getting off the bus. She's not vulnerable. So that's an area that needs to be looked at. I think we've gone from being far too tight to far too loose on PVGs. But if you do your PVGs, and if you're looking at the vehicle, when you get your volunteer through the door, you're checking their MOT, their insurance, their vehicle servicing, also doing some driver training, which is another area of that social enterprise side and the sustainability. Midas for Cars, which the CTA provides, is an ideal opportunity to check your driver out, to give them some training, and to ensure that your guys are trained as far as possible. And basically, it's really that simple.
Mr. Berry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've had this before, but, a bus pass without a regular bus service or any bus service is of limited value. A bus pass, if you can't manage the walk from your front door to the bus stop, is of limited value. So those people who've got bus passes because of their age, but can't make use of public transport, obviously feel kind of left out. And, the question then is, do you want to try and provide some kind of parity with the people who are able to use public transport? So, for example, if you're making a trip to a hospital in Dundee and you can jump on the bus, it's going to cost you nothing because you're going to use your bus pass. If, however, you're in Aberfeldy, I'm going to use another worked example. If you're in Aberfeldy and there isn't a bus service to get you to the Nine Wells Hospital in Dundee, you're looking at maybe a community car scheme. And the community car scheme might charge you 45p a mile. That's generally what they charge. There are differences, but that's generally what they charge. Now, 45p a mile times 128 mile round trip is £57.60. So you're the little old lady sitting in Aberfeldy thinking, I'm going to go to my appointment at Nine Wells Hospital. Wow, £57.60 is a lot of money to potentially have to pay out. So the question is, now if that little lady could have used the bus from Aberfeldy down to Nine Wells, well, she could have done it for free. So there's a real discrepancy or a disparity between the people who can make use of public transport and those who can't. I don't think the concession reimbursement scheme is the right fit for community transport because of many of the things we've sort of touched on. But surely we can think of another system that can hopefully bring down that seemingly eye-watering cost of accessing services. So instead of saying, okay, it's 45p a mile, maybe that's still what the volunteer driver needs to get because they've got to cover their costs, but perhaps half the money is met by the user and half the money is met by the government or the local authority or whatever funding stream that is. I would say also, slightly countering what I've just said, I mean, if you are a car owner and you lived in Aberfeldy and you've got a hospital appointment at Nine Wells in Dundee, you're going to jump in your car, most likely, and make that trip. So that's what, it's going to cost you £56, whatever it was I said. That's how much it costs to drive a car. The hidden cost of driving a car is, a lot of it's forgotten about, because you've already bought the car and whatever. So, don't forget that driving a car around, which is what a vast majority of people who do live in rural communities are doing, there is a cost to that as well. So maybe in that light, £57.60 maybe doesn't seem so bad. So, you can argue it both ways, but I would say what the key thing to do would be bring in a scheme that can make community transport more affordable, but it doesn't need to be the bus pass concession reimbursement scheme.
Okay. Right. Jim.
Thank you, Kipina. We've had quite a long session, so I'm not going to detain you unduly with my questions, but I'd like to ask about the Change Fund. The committee has heard evidence from other community transport providers about their experience of the Change Fund, and of course there is a substantial amount of money allocated for that purpose. The Health and Social Care Change Fund, which is available to 32 local partnerships across the country for 2012-13, is valued at £80 million. No, hold on. £80 million is the figure that I've got in front of me. And I just wondered, from the perspective of your organisations, whether you have experience of supporting community transport provision through the Change Fund, and if so, if you could explain how this works.
Okay, in Highland it's certainly been an issue. I'm rather detached from it in a sense because the social work transport, although I've had some research into it, is managed separately from my team, and indeed adult social care in Highland is now handed over to NHS. It's a partnership between the council and NHS, but it's the NHS that have the operational responsibilities from it. There have certainly been approaches to community transport office groups from them to provide transport. It's not necessarily been with an understanding of what the CT groups are set up to do. There's often the feeling that they're trying to palm off the difficult bits to them. Certainly the community transport specialist in my team has had discussions with social work and then NHS people on the use of the Change Fund, but it's not really... I'm sorry?
Currently accessing it or not?
As a team, as a public transport team, no, we're not. I think some community transport groups will be making some use of it, but it's room for a lot of improvement, I would say.
You're saying it's fairly limited at the moment?
Yes.
The extent to which community transport providers access that
yes.
funding stream. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Does anyone else have a perspective?
Councillor Phillips and then Mr Berry.
I think it's fair to add that the funding for the joint pilot with the NHS and the ambulance service that we're about to set up, we're still talking about where the money's coming from, but I suspect the NH contribution to that will involve the Change Fund.
Mr Berry?
Yeah, I mean, the Change Fund is obviously a relatively new funding stream, and I think given it's looking at older people, you know, the issues that older people face with transport is an obvious area that could potentially be funded. I've got to say, in Dundee, I think we potentially missed the trick a little bit. There was nobody from the sort of transport side who was involved with the decision-making process. They never sought our advice, and a small bid went in for a little project, and it did get some support from the group, but it was a really small scale. I would say now that I'm perhaps, as a local authority transport person, a bit more aware of it, and if I could think of schemes, because I think there is a pressing need for better better transport for older people, if we can tap into the Change Fund, that would be something I would be looking to do and something I would be putting in perhaps a bid for future years. But I think perhaps on this first round of funding, it was perhaps overlooked by some people on the transport side, and because the decision makers tended to be social workers, the projects tended to be, social workers and health people, the projects tended to be in that area more than in transport. But I think, you know, whenever I go to community meetings, whenever I engage in this subject, transport is a key issue for older people, and therefore it must be an ideal candidate for securing some of the Change Fund money in future years.
If you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have found it very difficult to be tactful about the Change Fund. Because well, no, I'll come to the reason why. In general, CT groups around Scotland are less than impressed. The impression is that it's been hijacked by the NHS and by other statutory groups, that it hasn't got to where it's needed to go, and that all it has done is filled gaps of cuts that have happened elsewhere, and that it really hasn't done the job it was supposed to. Having said that, Aberdeenshire, it just disappeared. I still don't know what it's doing in Aberdeenshire, but 6 months ago, I started working with ACVO, Aberdeen Council for Voluntary Organisations. They organised the Change Fund for Aberdeen City, And because we've had the conversation, through their befriending series that they've put together, Community Transport has basically come out and said, we're a problem in Aberdeen City. So we're now having that conversation, and that came about through the Change Fund. And equally, hopefully, any solution will come about and be funded through the Change Fund. So that's a real positive, which is why I said now I'm a little bit more positive about it. But around and about Scotland, David's comment that in Highland it's an issue is probably the biggest understatement of the world. It really hasn't done anything for community transport in general, or very little.
That probably is the primary purpose of it, but it's about making the people who oversee the operation of the fund aware of what community transport can bring in terms of what they're trying to achieve.
But if
we're trying to bring about a shift from, where care is no longer provided in hospitals, but is actually more optimally provided in the community, and community transport can help keep people in the community.
Well, if I tell you that I had meetings originally with the Change Fund in Aberdeenshire and long emails, and eventually even I got sick of arguing and walked away. And it takes a lot to stop me talking.
You can pass these comments on to the Health Committee when they're having their discussions on this. Margaret.
Yeah, I'm going to be asking you questions about reductions of local authority funding and also looking at alternative funding sources. One of the community transport operators that came to give evidence highlighted the reduction in their local authority funding for the community transport services, which is obviously a big concern. One organisation faced a 20% reduction in the grant. The other question as well, and I'll go into my questions in a minute, is looking at alternative sources of funding for public sector transport contracts. So my first question will be, probably Rachel yourself, you know, what impact have you seen in budget reductions for the organisations, and how does it affect their ability to actually support the community transport services?
Can I clarify a little bit? Are you looking at reductions in funding for the CTA or for CT groups?
For CTA groups.
Right, okay. Across the reduction in local authority funding for individual groups has been quite dramatic since the end of the RCTI, and has been quite detrimental. There's been whole groups shut down. I heard of a group where the gentleman had to cash in a pension in order to continue the group, and this is a personal pension, in order to continue the group's work. Our own group up in Aberdeenshire, we had to stop one service and sort things out and just cut things. It hasn't been easy at all across Scotland because of the cuts. What you have to need to remember at the same time is you've got your cuts, but you've also got costs going up and up and up. So what might be a 20% cut, actually in reality is 40%, because your maintenance costs, especially given you've got an older fleet, it's just a rolling set of disasters for a lot of community transport groups. Community Transport Association side, again, because the funding of that has been cut, that has meant that we lost one advice officer in Scotland. We now have one full-time director and one operation supervisor, or whatever Sheila's title is, on something like 18 hours a week, which really, when you're covering all of Scotland and trying to give advice to regular CT groups and developing CT groups and communities that are looking at it, it's just, you know, they're constantly fighting fires, they're constantly trying to chase themselves, and we as a Scottish committee are constantly saying, well, we need this and we need that, and it's a huge amount of pressure to put on 1.5 people. And again, it has an effect on quality, because Eric mentioned it earlier about, you know, monitoring quality standards. There are things to do with the Section 19 permits we need to look at. The guys can't do it, not in the amount of time they have. So long-term, Community Transport Association needs good, solid, long-term funding. Their current funding is very shaky. And again, how can they help community transport groups when they don't know if they've got a job long-term? You know, so it's not a positive story, I'm sorry.
Any ideas how the operators can actually make up for the loss of this funding from local authorities? Or has other groups actually been quite proactive and come up with other ideas to do this?
The standard idea that we should all become self-sustainable and we should all run social enterprises is, again, it's this wonderful panacea that has been handed down to us that just doesn't work. Because many community transport groups are small community groups run by 5 or 6 people in the community. All they want to do is put transport on to get people around and about. To then say you have to run a business on top of that is desperately silly, really, because you have to have a business mind, you have to find the business, you have to run it. And running a business on its own is hard work. Running a business that's supporting a community transport group, you're doubling your stress and workload. And when you're talking about community activists, it's just too much for many. Now, some have managed to do that, and great, that's fantastic. We do it ourselves in my own organisation, and we run a social enterprise. And if it works, great. But equally, there have to be other funds long-term, and there aren't any. There are no long-term, or very few that I know of, revenue funds for community transport that will provide. I mean, SPT is probably the only organisation I know that really supports community transport. There's a big gap there that we need to do. But we need to recognise that sustainability in community transport, the two words do not go together. They really don't. If a bus route was sustainable, a commercial organisation, an operation would be doing it and should be doing it. The reason of community transport goes back to what I said earlier. We're the bowl beneath the sieve that all of the vulnerable people fall through. That is never, ever going to be self-sustainable, and it needs something long-term, solid to fund it.
Mr. Phillips.
Thank you. I'll start with the general, then move to the specific. I'm aware that every community transport group could do more and would like to do more than it currently does. Picking up from where Rachel left off, the question of small community enterprises being business-like, it's an issue with social enterprises all over the shop. And frankly, we are having to gentle people towards having a more business mindset. I mean, a lot of organisations are set up as charities. They have to make returns to OSCA. There is a need to conduct yourself properly if you're in receipt of public money and to account for it. So I think it's reasonable to expect that. The next thing, I asked when I took over responsibility for this about the impact of the loss of ring fencing of council funding, and my question was, have we preserved what would have been ring fenced had that still been in place? And it's difficult to do an accurate reconciliation, but pretty much the answer is yes, we have. But we come to the specifics and the evidence that you mentioned last time in the one group that had a 20% cut. I read the evidence from that particular organisation very closely yesterday, and you wouldn't find anywhere in the evidence any mention of the fact that the community transport group is doing things other than community transport. Now, what it's turned itself into is a very admirable community interest enterprise, and is providing a lot of other services to the community. But it carried with it a lot of overhead that was being funded out of the community transport grant. And we felt that if we started funding painting and decorating services out of the community transport grant, we would be denying the opportunity for funding to other groups who had a similar need elsewhere in the Highland Council area. So we had some fairly detailed conversations with the directors of that company, and we reached a position where we felt at least the directors of the company understood the situation and were, if not comfortable with it, at least understood it. There's another reason for a certain level of cutback across the board to our community groups, because when we looked at what they were all allocating the money for, we saw that quite a number of groups were building up a maintenance emergency fund, because the normal operating costs include a factor for routine servicing, but everybody wants to set some money aside in case they need a new gearbox, and as the fleet ages, it becomes more likely that you'll need one. So we said, look, we'll set up a contingency fund for that. We'll carry the risk. If you have an event like that, you come to us and you draw on the fund, and we will reduce the funding to reflect that and only that. And I think everybody understood that and was comfortable with that. There is a certain residual risk on us that if more gearboxes break than we've actually reserved for, then we have to carry it. But doing that has allowed us to support 5 more groups this year, and we were trying to balance the need to maintain the groups we currently have and extend the service with no extra money coming in. There is one other group where we are currently in conversation. They don't want to take the service into a Section 22 area. We think they should. We're reluctant to contemplate increasing funding in those circumstances to the extent that they won't be taking fares in when they could be. And that's the kind of day-to-day issue that we have to deal with. We're not trying to be oppressive to any group when we have these conversations. We're not trying to force Section 22 on people to whom it's not suitable. But there are cases where we have to have those fairly hard conversations simply to spread a scarce amount of money as sensibly as we can. I hope that answers your question.
Mr. Berry.
Yeah, I agree. This idea of this community transport going down the social enterprise route is problematic. And another thing that maybe Rachel didn't say, but a lot of the people who are involved in these groups, you know, are probably retirees. You know, they're not interested in becoming businesses. They're not young, vibrant 50-year-olds, 40-year-olds. They're people who are often in their 70s and even 80s who are running the schemes, and they have no interest in the additional bureaucracy that comes along with doing a profitable sort of social enterprise. Other sources of funding, I'm going to have to say, obviously local authorities got given the sort of remnants of the RCTI and UCTI, but there's 2 other public sector agencies that I must draw attention to, and that is NHS, Territorial Bodies, and Scottish Ambulance Service. And I feel we've had a long-running saga debate with those sort of agencies, public sector, fellow public sector people, and said, you know, we would like to see you put more into it, because a huge amount of community transport activity is around hospital appointments and healthcare appointments, a huge amount. And I just feel that perhaps it's not properly recognised by NHS boards and Scottish Ambulance Service. And another area that's in our submission that, you know, the Scottish Ambulance Service is beginning to contract and restrict who it takes on its patient transport services. So that's its ambulance, its non-emergency ambulances. And they are doing less, and the natural result of that is that people will obviously have to find other means. Some will go with family, some will go in, maybe get on the bus, but some will inevitably come over to the community transport sector, and more pressure will come on the CT sector. And that pressure has come across, but no funding was released by the Scottish Ambulance Service to support and help sustain the network of community transport groups across Scotland. And I felt that was a flaw in their strategic plan. I mean, I flagged it up, ATCO flagged it up and said, look, if Scottish Ambulance Service wants to perhaps potentially migrate 1 million journeys or 500,000 journeys out of their business, someone's going to have to pick up that slack. It might be family, it might be buses, but surely, you know, if you're going to get rid of all these people, perhaps you want to pass on some of the funding as well.
Got that message, and we'll
right.
put it on to the Health and Transport Committee. Margaret, do you want to ask your next question?
Yeah. Bearing in mind, that funding is being reduced, and if some community transport operators still need to exist to be there, they may have to look at alternative sources of funding, maybe probably from the public sector transport contracts. Would this be a realistic option for these organisations if they need this income to supplement what they're doing and to survive? And within that question, is there individuals, you've already said that, you know, some people are in their 70s and they're not interested, but the other side of the coin is I've been to a community transport operator where there is somebody in their 70s doing it and they do have the skills for tendering for other work, And the other organisation that I saw the other day as well is somebody's in their 40s, maybe early 50s, helping to run this organisation as well. So I don't think it's a sort of, goes without saying that everybody in their 70s don't have the skills and they're all that age. There is a variety of ages working within the sector. But does anybody, or from yourself maybe Rachel, your knowledge of these organisations, is there individuals that do have the skills for tendering for, you know, commercial work, and would you have the resources for the others that didn't have those skills to develop those skills so they could then actually tender for commercial work?
Quick answer, yes. Dyla Community Bus already tenders and runs contracts with Aberdeen City and Aberdeenshire, both under PSV and Section 19. Stirling Dyla Journey run, and they tender and run a lot of contracts, as do LCTS, as do several Orkney Disability Forum, I think, do as well. So there is quite a strength around the CTs in Scotland of people who tender and win contracts. In fact, it was Duncan from Stirling Dyla Journey that taught me how to tender the first time. And again, other people have been in touch with him, and you know, we do all work together that way. So yes, it's possible for the bigger, more resilient groups. The smaller community groups are, as John said, you know, it's just not going to happen. And there are more of them than there are of us. So whereas, yes, there is the almost a solution for the larger groups, there's still this gap for the smaller one. And it's not a solution because it doesn't bring a huge amount of money in. Yes, it's really important to us, and from an organisational point of view, it's vital to our sustainability long term, but it doesn't run the CT groups, the CT services, because there's just not enough money in it if you want to be commercially viable. There's also a lot of grief and hassle involved in tendering, and the local authorities sometimes could make it easier, or rather could slightly adapt some of their tendering processes to make it easier. Aberdeenshire Council are doing that, and I'm looking forward to seeing how they're going to do it, because I think we could probably learn from them. But in general, yes, there is a great wealth of knowledge around Scotland, but it comes with a caveat of it's not for everyone, it's not a panacea, and there is a, you know, it will only fill a small gap, because it also puts extra work on you as well. If you suddenly go from, as we did, 3 vehicle running services locally for community transport to 10, that all with 10 drivers and all with the associated employment issues, and then you have the volunteers that fill in, and if you're running contracts you are tied to doing them, and if you get it wrong, believe me, the council batters you very quickly. You know, they don't care that you're a community transport group. They've given you a contract and they expect you to do it.
Does anyone else want to say anything briefly? Councillor Phillips and then Mr Stewart.
We do have one community transport group in Morvern which have a Saturday bus contract, straightforward public sector bus contract. We have hybrid operations, and this is always interesting. I mentioned the Helmsdale group earlier, which is subcontracting a piece of work from Stagecoach, running a Section 22 service to join with the first morning service from further down the road. So there are opportunities, but they're marginal, and there are large areas. But bear in mind, you need to think about the geography of different places. And certainly in the Highlands, in the more remote areas, which are recognised as officially fragile according to a number of important criteria. If you cut the funding for community transport, it will simply die, and it is the only transport that there is in many places.
Mr Stewart.
We operate 4 timetabled services through contracts with community transport operators. But if you treat a community transport operator the same you do as a bus company, bus companies have got the resource and the professionalism to deal with these kind of things. It's about being sort of self-help. We provide the assistance. You know, we're talking about social enterprise. We're not expecting the community transport group to take that on. We're taking it on board. We're leading on that. We're developing the model. We're providing assistance. We're not saying, thou shalt We are saying there's a benefit to us, a benefit to you. Some of the work we've done is actually given some work to the Community Transport Group to give basic underpinning support so that they do their other activities. It's not about simply saying, if you do all of these things. So we're probably a bit more fortunate than many other local authorities because we've got the resource and looking after practically half the country. It probably is easier for SPT, but you need to lead in these things. You can't simply start laying down rules for a 70-year-old. There's not wrong with a 70-year-old, but you can't start laying down rules that you need to start delivering this. We facilitate it because there's a net benefit to us as well. So this is really about a wee bit of give and take. And we've taken some work from Glasgow City Council, had a very significant budget cut on their clubs, their volunteer clubs. They had to save £500,000. What we do now is we take the Glasgow City Council bus. It's a community transport driver that takes it up. We pay for the insurance and the diesel, but no overheads because that's covered through the authority. And we reduced that by 42% and we're delivering more services now. That's a model that we will have to expand more and more, but not just say to the CT Group. We made it all happen. We ran about, did all the schedules. We placed the buses. We got the drivers positioned because it's out with their ability at this stage. But we need to develop with them. You know, we can't take positions on this. There's an end game for us in this, as it is for the CT groups as well. So, you know, just giving CT funding will simply not work. It needs to be looked at in the round. Neither having a central bus fund itself, because it's the operating cost of the bus that will blow the cost of the capital right out of the water. So, you know, I think it would certainly take more money, and by the time I get back this afternoon, I'll be looking at the change fund, because I wasn't even aware. I'll have a bid in this afternoon. But that's the kind of thing that we're obviously missing something. So, you know, it is, the NHS is a problem. By their own declaration, the SAS patient delivery costs are nearly 4 times more expensive than we have in our area, which, as I say, covers 42% of the population. So you can go to a hospital and find a SAS patient transport, a demand-responsive vehicle, and a community transport. It's absolutely mad. It's mad, and we believe that we're well placed to coordinate that, but not to do the work. With the community transport groups have got to come to the party as well, you know. Thank you.
Okay, any other member got any questions? Panel, do you think we've covered everything? We've had a fairly long session. Can I thank you all very much for coming? It has been extremely helpful to our inquiry. If you've got anything that you think on your journey home that you should have, you wanted to bring up, please write in and let us know. But again, thank you very much, and I briefly suspend this session to allow the witnesses to leave the room and for us to move into private session. Thank you.